Hi, I'm Bryan Jensen. I'm with UW Extension's Integrated Pest Management Program, and I'd like to spend a few minutes to talk to you about the late season corn insect pests. If you would like current insecticide recommendations, I would suggest that you go to our learning store. You can see the URL at the bottom of the screen and look up our publication titled Pest Management in Wisconsin Field Crops. If you did a search for its number, A3646, that should be your top choice. For the late season insects that we'll be talking about, we'll cover corn rootworm, western bean cutworm, Japanese beetle, and corn earworm, although it's primarily a pest on sweet corn. Corn rootworm is a key, meaning very important insect pest that we have on corn. There are two species of economic importance. Actually, there's a third, that's a southern corn rootworm, but that's hardly ever a problem, if ever, in Wisconsin. So the two species of economic concern are the northern, which is a solid green color, and the western, which is more of a lime green with black stripes. Regarding whichever species you're talking about, there is only one generation per year. The larvae will hatch in early June, and that's weather dependent, and they will feed exclusively on corn roots. And that's why they're considered a pest of continuous corn. Yes, there are other prairie plants that they can feed on, but in the field crop area, corn roots are the only thing the larvae will feed on. The adults emerge in early July, perhaps a little bit earlier, depending on the weather again, and they lay eggs starting from early August through mid-September or so, early September. They overwinter as eggs, usually laid in the soil of cornfields, and that's one of the management concerns we'll talk about a little bit later. There are some concerns with western corn rootworm laying eggs in soybeans, but we'll cover that in just a little bit. So as far as identification purposes, these two individuals are western corn rootworm, kind of that pale yellow to lime green color, 1/4 of an inch long with black stripes on their back. At times, the male western corn rootworm, the lines will fuse together and you'll have a black blotch on their wing covers. The northern corn rootworm will vary in color. When they first emerge, they're kind of a pale yellow or pale tan color, but eventually they'll take on a very uniform green color. The larvae feed on corn roots, as we mentioned, and primarily on corn roots. And that reduces the water and nutrient uptake through the root system. Above ground symptoms, you can see lodging or sometimes what we call goosenecking. You may also see at times some nutrient deficiency symptoms just because the larvae are feeding on the corn, reducing the root mass and the chance for that plant to take up other nutrients. The adults will feed on silk, and that can be an economic concern. We'll talk about that in a little bit. They also will feed on pollen of corn plants as well as many other species of plants. That usually is not a concern. Certainly it is not a concern in corn. And the westerns, and the westerns only, will feed on leaves, scarring the leaf tissue. Again, that may look bad, but I have never seen it to be an economic concern on field corn. Here's a picture of what the larvae will look like. They will grow up to 3/8 of an inch long. They will have a tan or light brown head. And they, as I mentioned a couple of times, will feed on the corn roots. This is a picture of what a healthy looking corn root mass will look like. The healthy roots are nice white, pearly white color. And also I would have you notice that roots come off at the nodes. We can see a node right here as well as a node inside, and there's at least one more node here that we can pick up. And that's going to be important as we talk a little bit later on the node injury scale that was developed by Iowa State. Here's a shot of what rootworms can do. We can see a little bit of scarring up on this individual root here, a little bit of browning scarring up here and over here. But according to that nodal root rating system, we are looking for rootworm damage when they are pruning that root back to with an inch to inch and a half of the stalk. That's where we get our major economic concern. Above ground symptoms, we can see some goosenecking here, some really flat laying plants to those that are kind of lodged just a little bit, some goosenecking here. I would caution that rootworms do cause lodging, but there are several other things that could cause corn to go down. High winds, compaction, perhaps also some stalk diseases. And also do understand that just because your corn is standing straight, that does not mean it is injury-free from corn rootworms. And just a reminder that when you reduce that root mass and you have significant feeding, you can also see some other symptoms that maybe are not direct causes of rootworm feeding, but are some of the, if you want to call it a byproduct, and this would be nutrient deficiency symptom, kind of a secondary symptom. I had mentioned that rootworms will feed on silk, and that can be an economic concern, primarily in corn that is planted early or corn that's planted late, because those early or late planted fields can be like a magnet. The adults really are attracted to those green silks to come in and feed on. So in this situation, we can see where the adult rootworm beetles, and that can be both the northern and the western, have fed on the silks and they have fallen down. The importance here is that that silk grows maybe an inch or so per day until the corn is pollinated. And its primary purpose is to intercept a grain of pollen. And the longer that silk is, the greater the surface area, and therefore the greater chance that that silk can intercept a pollen grain to fertilize the ovule. So when you have significant feeding, you really reduce the area, the surface area that a silk can intercept a pollen grain, and you can end up with a near barren ear. And finally, the western and the western only can feed on the leaf tissue. This appears to be rather severe, but at least on a field-wide basis, I've never seen this to be an economic concern in field corn. Sometimes in late planted sweet corn, when conditions are right, yes, you can see some significant feeding on the leaves to the point that it might consider spraying, but that's rather unusual. There are two purposes to scout for corn rootworm beetles. The first is protection from silk clipping, and the other reason we'll talk about in the next slide is to predict the need for either rotation or the use of a management tactic the following year on continuous corn. So let's talk first about protection from silk clipping. And the time period you would be scouting for those beetles is when the corn is pollinating, when you have green silks out there. Count the number of beetles per plant. And the threshold is when the silks are clipped a half inch of the tip of the ear, and roughly that's going to be about 5 to 6 beetles per plant. For the second purpose, and that's predicting the need for a rootworm insecticide or some sort of management tactic the next year in continuous corn, you need to scout during the egg laying period, which in most of the state of Wisconsin you start in early to mid-August. That's when the bulk of the eggs are being laid, and most of them have finished egg laying by the first part of September. To get a good field average, I would walk a W-shaped pattern within the field and count the number of rootworm beetles in 10 sets on 5 non-consecutive plants. So that's a total of 50 plants that you want to count on. You should scout at least 2 to 3 different times to get a better idea for what's going on, because when you're in that field, that is a single snapshot of beetle populations. And a second scouting, if not a third, can make us feel a little bit more comfortable with those numbers. And the threshold is to treat or rotate if that field has an average greater than 3/4 of a beetle per plant. Within the last few decades, we've had some management concerns creep up on us in Wisconsin, and certainly within the last couple of years, we've had one that's caught a lot of press as of late, and that's the resistance to the BT rootworm transgenic hybrid. But previous to that, both the northern and the western corn rootworms have found a way to adapt to our corn-soybean rotations. And the northern corn rootworm adult has done that through extended diapause. Diapause is, in layman's terms, is a period of arrested development, and for rootworms, it's a winter chill period that breaks that diapause. So what the northern has done is a very small segment of their population has this extended diapause characteristics, and that means it takes 2 winter chill periods before the eggs will hatch. So that's one way they had adapted to that corn bean rotation. We have found this happening in past years in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa. The western corn rootworm has a way that they have adapted to our corn soybean rotation, and that is they have learned, if you will, to lay eggs in soybeans. They only require 1 chill period for those eggs to hatch, and when they're laying eggs in the soybeans, you get a chill period, and then the next year it's corn. So the eggs survive because the eggs survive, they hatch, and the larvae will feed on the corn roots. And as I had mentioned earlier, one of the latest developments has been the resistance of the rootworms, of the corn rootworms, and their transgenic hybrids. There is a way to monitor for the western corn rootworm if they're laying eggs in soybeans, and that area of the state of Wisconsin has primarily been in the southeast corner. We would suggest, if that is a concern, if you think you're in an area where you have this rotation-resistant western corn rootworm, and that is to use yellow sticky traps, specifically the Farrakhan AM unbaited yellow sticky trap. It's a visual attractant, so it is really important that you use that specific trap, because that trap may look yellow to you as would other traps, but sometimes insects key on different wavelengths of the yellow or of the color spectrum to be a little bit more general about it. And our numbers for the thresholds are based on that Farrakhan AM unbaited yellow sticky trap. The AM is an acronym for apple maggot. These traps have been used for a long time for apple maggot monitoring in apple orchards. So it's a visual attractant. We suggest you place 12 traps per field, and attach the traps on a stake somehow just above the soybean leaves, and you may have to move them up. The important thing is to keep them above the soybean canopy so the rootworms can see them when they're flying through. You would want to monitor the adult activity during that egg laying period, which is early August to early September. Check at approximately 7 to 10 day intervals. And that time period is not critical as long as that trap remains above the plant canopy, hasn't been blown down, or for whatever reason isn't sticking anymore because of a rainy weather. Only count adult western corn rootworm beetles. You will find northerns on them as well. Don't count them, because it is only the western corn rootworm that is feeding and laying eggs on the soybean leaves. You would want to divide the total number of beetles caught by the number of traps, and also divide that by the number of trapping days. And I have an example for you in just the next slide. The threshold is if you have more than 5 beetles per trap per day during that egg laying period, there will be enough egg laying in that soybean field that you would have to use a rootworm management tactic next year as long as you're planting into corn. So an example, let's assume you caught 1,680 western corn rootworm beetles, and your trapping period was August 8th through August 6th, which is a total of 28 days, and you used 12 traps per field. So let's take that total number of beetles, which is 1,680, divide by 28 days that you were trapping, divided by 12 traps per field, and that's equal to 5 beetles per trap per day, which is our economic threshold. There's a picture of the trap. Again, it's the Farrakhan AM unbaited yellow sticky trap, and please use just that trap. The other yellow sticky traps made by other manufacturers have not been tested for corn rootworm attractiveness. Okay, the other management concern that we've had with corn rootworm beetles has been their resistance to the Bt hybrids. This has happened in several Midwestern states, including Wisconsin and some isolated areas, and it's a western corn rootworm only phenomenon. There has been some suspicion by the northern, but it's only been confirmed by the western corn rootworm. So let's talk about a few guidelines to slowing the Bt resistance. One method, or at least a couple methods, I should say, to slow the resistance is field monitoring. Both adult beetle counts and assessing root damage are going to be critical as we bring in IPM tactics to control these and to slow down resistance. With the adult beetle counts, it's going to help with us with a selection of control tactics. And with that, you would need at least, I think, a minimum of 2 weekly counts, 2 counts that are at least 2 weeks apart. Because again, they are a snapshot for that time period when you're scouting, and you really want to keep you want to have a good assessment of what's happening over time in that cornfield when the adult beetles are laying eggs. Assessing the root damage is going to be important because it's going to help us validate our management practices. As we have gotten away from the use of seed treatments and other soil insecticides and have been relying on the Bt hybrids to control rootworms, I think we've gotten away from the point where we feel comfortable with some of those other management tactics. So with those fields that we might be using a soil insecticide or a seed treatment, coming back in and validating how well those management tactics have worked will help us feel a little bit more comfortable with them. And also it's going to provide us a heads up on the rotation-resistant western corn rootworm. And let me back up to that first bullet point under assessing root damage. It's also going to help us prepare for when resistance is starting to break down to our Bt hybrids within the field. So the value of beetle scouting is going to help us fine-tune and diversify our rootworm management recommendations. And that's going to be the key, I think, to keeping these Bt hybrids valid and useful. It's going to help us identify where rotation may still be an option, that is rotating out of corn. When we have low beetle counts, extremely low beetle counts, at roughly about below 3/4 of a beetle per plant, then the seed treatments may be of value. But those labels will have indicated that they're only valuable under low to moderate populations. And I think under moderate or higher populations, those fields might be those that we use a at-plant soil insecticide. And certainly, as long as you're not having any problems with Bt resistance on those high fields, those fields with high beetle numbers, they may be your best option. So what we really need to do is to diversify our corn rootworm management and not rely on a single tactic. Let's talk a little bit about rootworm damage assessment. And I mentioned earlier the nodal injury scale. That's going to be a way that we can quantify the amount of damage that we have in the field. It was developed by Iowa State researchers. It's a 0 to 3 scale. The number to the left of the decimal is equal to the equivalent number of nodes that are pruned back to within 1.5 inches of the stalk. The number to the right of the decimal is the percentage of that next node of roots that is pruned back. The economic threshold, if we're over 3/4 nodal injury scale of 0.75, at that point or higher, we will very likely have economic damage. If we're below a nodal injury scale of 0.25, I'm pretty confident saying, we will have no economic damage. Yes, there'll be a little bit of scarring, pruning, but for the most part, we should not have any economic damage at that low of a nodal injury scale. When we're in that area of 0.25 to 0.75, it's kind of a gray area. Other factors are going to weigh in on whether or not you have economic damage, like hybrid, like weather. If it's extremely dry, that could decrease or rather increase the amount of economic damage. So that 0.25 to 0.75 is kind of a gray area. So our value of rootworm assessment is going to be identifying those times when you are starting to have problems with the rotation-resistant western corn rootworm or the extended diapause of the northern corn rootworm. That's going to be important to identify early on, so that you can then treat first-year corn if you have to. On continuous corn, as we kind of talked about earlier, it's going to help us validate the efficacy of our treatments. And with the Bt hybrids especially, if we're out evaluating the roots for damage, it's going to hopefully help us catch resistance at a very early stage and when it's more manageable. And it will help us validate how our seed treatments and soil insecticides are working. What do you need to know about your Bt hybrid and how to manage it? First thing you need to know is what Bt proteins have you been planting. It's important that you rotate those Bt proteins on a regular basis. You want to know, has that protein been working? You want to do some root assessments. You want to make sure that you catch resistance at a very early stage so that you can use other tactics to manage corn rootworms. And don't assume that all lodge corn has rootworm damage, and don't assume that straight standing corn does not have rootworm damage. You absolutely have to get in there, assess your root damage, and the best time to do that is mid to late July. That's a time period when the rootworm larvae are starting to finish feeding. You can delay that a little bit to the first part of August if you like, but if you wait much longer after the first part of August, you might have some root regeneration that would mask any damage that you had earlier. And also, don't assume because you have high beetle numbers in that field that whatever management tactic that you use is not working, because beetles do migrate around a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier, we do want to rotate our Bt proteins on a regular basis, so we're not using that same mode of action over a period of time. And do control your volunteer corn in you are essentially exposing that generation to another year of that BT hybrid. So you want to make sure you control that so you have a good clean break. And let's switch now to western bean corn rootworm. It's a relatively new pest in Wisconsin. They've been moving into the state since the maybe 2005, 2006. There is only one generation per year. The moth does not damage corn, but it emerges in early to mid-July. The eggs are laid and clustered, on average maybe 50 eggs per cluster, but that can vary maybe from as few as 20 per egg mass to maybe upwards of 200 per egg mass. When the eggs are first laid, they are a white or cream colored, and eventually as those eggs mature, they'll take on more of a darker purple color. They are dome-shaped, and they usually will hatch, weather dependent, within 5 to 7 days of being laid. Here's a picture of what the eggs and the egg mass can look like. Roughly on average 50 eggs per mass. When the larvae hatch, they'll feed for about 1 month, and they can disperse to adjacent plants either within rows or across rows. Newly hatched larvae are kind of a darkish brown color with a black head. As those larvae mature, they can grow up to an inch and a half long. They'll have very faint tan striping on the back with kind of grayish sides, and their head will be kind of an orange or tan color. And there will be 2 dark rectangles right behind the head. Here's a picture of what a mature larvae can look like, and the most diagnostic symptom I can give you is those 2 dark triangles right behind the head. To manage them, you can use pheromone traps to monitor adult flight. That's going to help you determine when you need to start scouting cornfields, or you can keep track of growing degree days, and at about 1,350 degree days, base 50, is when I would first start scouting fields. That's peak moth flight. I would choose those fields that are tassel first, or the most advanced fields within that area. Those are going to be most attractive to the adult female to come in and lay eggs. The eggs, look for them. That's going to be what you're going to base your economic threshold on and your decisions. They're laid on the upper surface of the upper leaf in the corn plant. Economic threshold for field corn is when 5% of the plants are infested. And for sweet corn, it's a little bit lower. For sweet corn, it's 4% infested plants. You can manage western bean cutworm using foliar insecticides, and that scouting information is going to be very important because it helps with our application timing. You want to time your application as close to egg hatch as possible and before they burrow into the corn ear. We can also use some BT hybrids. The VIP3A and the Cry1F protein will have some efficacy against western bean cutworm. Okay, Japanese beetle. Within the last few years in Wisconsin, they have become a pest, primarily because of the silk clipping. There's 1 generation per year, and the idea of the adult beetles is quite easy. They are a kind of a metallic looking beetle. The thorax area will be kind of a bright shiny green. The wing covers will be a shiny bronze color, and there will be 6 tufts of white hair along the edge of the abdomen on each side. As I mentioned, they will clip silk on average. It takes about 3 beetles per plant before they're high enough, and the concentration is high enough that you can affect pollination. And usually, at least what we've seen so far, is that Japanese beetles tend to be concentrated along field edges or in certain spots of the field. So spot spraying for Japanese beetles can be beneficial, can be useful. And finally, we'll talk about the corn earworm. Not so much a problem on field corn, but it is a key pest on sweet corn, and one that is covered under the Certified Crop Advisor's exam. They don't overwinter in Wisconsin, but they migrate up here on spring and spring and summer storm fronts, and their most important reason for causing damage is that they feed on developing kernels. The adult is a kind of a nondescript moth. The larvae can be up to 1.5 inches long. The head is kind of a darker brown. They are striped between darker and lighter colors, and those they can have variable coloration in that striping. They can be yellow, green, brownish, or reddish. In this slide, we can kind of see some of the damage that they've done to developing kernels. Usually it's not just a single kernel or two, but it's kind of a wide area that they can feed on corn. This one happens to be kind of a brownish type color individual, and there'll be others, and again this one is kind of a green color. To manage corn earworms, it's very important to use a pheromone trap. That will help you to monitor adult populations. They are migratory. Those pheromone traps will help you determine when they are moving into your area, and keep those traps close to silk and sweet corn, which are most attractive to the adults to come in and lay eggs. The threshold that we have for sweet corn is when you get a significant trap flight or trap catch, and that's about 10 adults per trap per night. Here's a picture of what a pheromone trap can look like. Again, keep it close to pollinating sweet corn fields. That's where most of the adults are going to be attractive. You see this little orange square at the bottom. That's the lure, and the adults, the males in this case, will get caught in the trap, work their way up into the cone at the top. And again, to finish up with late season corn insect pests, with corn earworms, if you have a significant trap catch of approximately 10 adults per night, and you have pollinating silken corn, developing corn ears, that's when you would want to start your spray schedule for corn earworm. Thank you.